Mom! Mom! A 10-year-old girl yelled as she swung open the front door to her house. She stumbled in, her older brother following close behind and shutting the door once they were both inside. She flicked off her trainers without undoing the laces and skipped into the kitchen, still with her rucksack on. Her socks made her slide across the tiles towards her mother, who was reading a book laid on the kitchen counter. At the last second, her mother looked up, turned around and caught the young girl in her arms and gave her a big squeeze. "Mom, guess what?" the girl said excitedly. "You are my homework this time." The mother looked confused. The girl slung her rucksack off and unzipped it on the floor, fishing out a piece of paper and gesturing it towards her mother. "This is our homework over Thanksgiving break," the girl enthusiastically told her. At this point, her brother walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge door to get a cold can of cola. The mother scanned the paper and read that the assignment was a project on the students' parents when they were 10 years old themselves, where they lived, who with, and what they were doing at the time. "You never had this project, did you, Jamie?" the mother asked her son. Jamie looked sheepish and took a swig of his fizzy drink. I did," he answered, "but I didn't mind about Dad." "Well, it's a good job we had 2 children, isn't it?" the mother laughed. "And I can assure you, Caroline, your project is going to be much more exciting than your brother's was." Caroline giggled and stuck her tongue out cheekily at her big brother Jamie. That night, as Caroline was tucked up in the sheets, her mother came into her room and sat on the end of her bed. She smiled at her daughter, who had the same curiosity and zeal as she had done. "I can't wait to hear about what you were like when you were my age," Caroline said quietly. "Do you think we were similar?" "Oh, yes," her mother replied. "I think, if we had met, we would have been great friends." It must have been real different, growing up in France. I can't imagine growing up anywhere other than Texas. Caroline's mother laughed softly. "Yes, it was completely different. I will tell you all about it tomorrow, but for now, I think it's time to sleep." Saturday morning arrived, and streams of sunlight leaked through the curtains in Caroline's bedroom. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and cooking pancake batter wafted through the house, enticing her from her snuggly sheets and pillows. This was the first weekend morning in a long time that she didn't want to stay in bed. As soon as Caroline had opened her eyes, she ran to the bathroom, washed her face, and brushed her teeth. She ran back to her room equally as eagerly and got dressed in her favourite dungarees. Her father was in the kitchen making breakfast for the family, and had already brought down the boxes from the attic for her and her mother to go through together. Jamie had emerged from his room too, not quite as enthusiastically as his sister, but he was intrigued on learning about his mother's past. She didn't really talk about it much, but then he thought perhaps it was because they never asked. After breakfast, the family sat down in the front room, cardboard storage boxes strewn across the floor. Caroline had a notepad and pen, ready to make some notes. She held out an imaginary microphone in front of her mother. "Okay, let's start from the beginning. Name?" "Mrs. Fleur Nesbit," she replied. "And before you were married?" "Fleur Josephine Deschamps." Fleur's French accent suddenly reappeared, saying her maiden name. She had acquired a hybrid accent since living in the United States. People often questioned where she was from, noticing it wasn't an authentic Texan accent, but not being able to pin it down as anything specific. "When were you born?" 6th of July, 1934. My mother was pregnant with me during the spring and summer. She said she was sure the flowers were a little brighter than usual this particular year, which is why they named me Fleur. She fished out a photo album from one of the boxes. Inside, there were only a few photos. Caroline noticed that most of them had burn marks around the edges of them and thought she'd better not ask, and that her mother would probably explain why later. They established that Fleur was 10 in 1944 and 1945, the end of the Second World War. She had told her children before that she had been in France during the war, but never really gone into much detail, waiting for them to be old enough to understand. During these years, I lived with my grandpere at his farmhouse in Rampont, Normandy. We lived in the main house to start off with, but as the war became more of a threat and German soldiers took over the nearby towns, we moved into living in one of the barns on his land. We stayed there for quite a while, a couple of years, I think. Fleur showed her family a photo of her grandfather before the war. He was stood in front of his favourite vegetable patch, laughing in the sun, his kind eyes crinkling at the sides, just like she remembered. She hadn't looked at this photo in a long time, and it instantly made her heart feel heavy. She felt guilty for not having it on display in the house, but she thought it might make her too sad, seeing it all the time. Fleur cleared her throat and continued. He was a very brave man. I loved him very much. And he would have loved you both, Fleur told her family, who were all listening to every word. He was a doctor in our local village. I suppose that's why I'm a nurse today. I learned the basics of how to look after other people from him. In fact, I learned a lot from him. Fleur's memory flashed back to perhaps the most important lesson he had taught her. She told her family about how from the moment the war had begun, her grandfather had taught her how to play hide-and-seek, and over time, she had become incredibly good at finding tiny places to stow herself away in, which would eventually save her life. I had no idea at the time that he was preparing me for something serious. I just loved playing with him. I will never forget how lucky I was to have been in the care of such a wonderful human, Fleur said, looking at the photograph of him once more before placing it gently back in the box it had come from. There was another box with a blue lid and a label on the side that said, Ingo. Neither Jamie nor Caroline knew what this meant. Was it an acronym for something? A place, perhaps? Curious to find out, Caroline picked the box up and placed it in front of her mother. Fleur lifted the lid off and pulled out a bronze medal, a name tag, a photograph, and a postcard. The photograph was of a young girl and a scruffy-looking dog, with big brown eyes and uneven-sized ears. The girl was grinning, and the dog had his head lifted proudly, showing off the medal that hung from its collar. Caroline was confused for a second. Looking at the photo, it was like looking in a mirror. Then it clicked. "That's you!" she yelped excitedly. "That's you, Mom, when you were 10. You never told us you had a dog." "I wanted to wait for the right time. He wasn't just a dog, he was my best friend, and he saved my life," Fleur replied, handing the name tag to her children. It had the same letters engraved into it that are on the side of the box. Ingo. By now, even Fleur's husband was totally hooked, listening to his wife eagerly. "One evening, I went out to explore the nearby town of Saint-Lô," the mother said, picking up the postcard which had a black and white photo of a quaint French town with flower hanging baskets scattered on the buildings and a person on a bicycle. "I shouldn't have been there, especially when it was getting dark, but I would search the abandoned houses for treasures that had been left behind. Like pieces of shrapnel or cigarette tins with other languages written on them." Both of her children were silent, listening intently, their heads rested in their hands. I heard a rustling sound from behind a building, and I thought it might be someone who was hiding like me, or worse, a German soldier. I was terrified and ready to sprint home as fast as I could. But then a tiny dog popped out. He was a little shy at first, but once I offered him some of my cheese baguette, we were firm friends. From that point, we were inseparable. Fleur recounted, beaming with the fondness for the memory of Ingo. Fleur continued with her story, telling them all about life in the barn. She told them how, at first, her grandfather didn't want her to keep Ingo at all. She'd felt elated by finding him. The idea of having a companion in her timber prison had given her hope. But when her grandfather had nearly made her get rid of Ingo, she thought her heart might break. Luckily, he gave in and became very fond of Ingo himself. Eventually. He was so funny. He'd always make us laugh. We'd play together in the day and then snuggle up, listening to the gunfire in the distance at night. Having Ingo made everything a little bit less scary. He reminded us of what life had been like before, and what it could be in the future. "What happened to your grandpere?" Caroline softly asked, knowing the answer probably wouldn't be a happy one. Fleur took each of her children's hands and held them gently. "Remember I told you about hide and seek," she said. They both nodded. "One night, a troop of Nazi soldiers found our barn. Without hesitation, my grandpere woke me up and told me we were going to play our game. I knew something was wrong. We never usually played the game at night. I chose my best hiding spot under the floorboards, which was just big enough for me and Ingo to squeeze into. I could hear my own heart beating. I was so scared." Caroline's grip had tightened around her mother's hand. Fleur told them when the soldiers had broken in and interrogated her grandfather, he'd stood his ground and lied to the soldiers, saying he was the only person there. "Before they left," Fleur said, taking a deep breath, "they shot him." Caroline gasped, and Jamie let go of his mother's hand and put it over his mouth. Her husband just looked at the floor. Even after all of these years, the memory of that moment made her heart sink, and she remembered how incredibly frightened she'd been. Then, to get rid of the evidence of what they'd done, they set the barn on fire as they left, said Fleur. "Which is why these photos have burned edges." Caroline's question at the beginning of this project had been answered, but she didn't expect all of this to be the answer. By now, Fleur's entire family was staring at her in utter disbelief, clinging onto every word. The barn started to collapse, and I was trapped beneath a beam from the roof. But Ingo, my best friend, somehow found the courage to crawl out of a tiny gap, run across a war zone, and find a British soldier, and somehow alerted him of the danger I was in. He led the soldier back to the barn, where he pulled me from the blaze and carried me to safety. Looking back at it now, it seems even more incredible that a dog could have done that on his own. But it's true. It all happened. She ended the story and looked around at the rest of the room, her children in awe, and her husband seemed to be a bit teary-eyed. She told him this story before, but she thought perhaps imagining a girl of his own daughter's age going through all of that made it more real for him to imagine. Fleur took out the bronze medal and presented it to them. "It's called the Dickin Medal. It's awarded to animals who are extremely brave during times of conflict." She passed it to each of them, and they studied it closely, holding it in their palm like a fragile baby animal. They then placed it back in its box, along with the other pieces. What happened to him?" Jamie stuttered, like he was scared of the answer. Ingo? Oh, he stayed with me until he was a very old dog. He even lived here in America for a little while. He always wore his medal attached to his collar, and I made sure he had cheese sandwiches all the time. The children sighed with relief that Ingo hadn't come to a grisly end and had lived a happy life for the rest of his days. Well, I'm definitely going to have the best presentation at school, Caroline chirped, making them all laugh and lifting the mood of the room. That night, as Fleur lay in bed next to her husband, her memories swirled around in her head. She felt very conflicted about one matter in particular. She knew she should probably have her memories on display to honour them, but she couldn't get past the fear of feeling guilty every time she saw that photo of her grandfather. After all, he had died to save her. As if he could read her mind, her husband said gently, "You could put those photos on the wall, you know. And now that the kids know all about it, I think it would be wonderful to honour and remember Ingo and your grandpere every single day." Fleur continued looking at the ceiling. She knew he was right. "I'll think about it," she replied. The next day, 2 new picture frames were nailed to the wall, one holding the photo of Fleur and Ingo, and the other of Grandpere in the vegetable patch. As Fleur passed them, she smiled. Seeing them still hurt, but she knew that feeling would diminish over time, and eventually she'd just be left with feelings of love and pride. The family all curled up on the sofa together, and an interview started with a famous American journalist talking about her time reporting during the Second World War. On the screen, up popped an image of a quaint French town adorned with hanging baskets. It was St. Lo. The journalist went on to say that she had visited the town of St. Lo for a secret rendezvous with an MI5 agent, who had important information that needed to be relayed back to the Allied forces. However, on her journey there, she discovered a small dog in the back of her truck. When they arrived at St. Lo, they'd become separated. "I just wish I knew where he'd gone. I worried about that little dog for weeks," the journalist said. Fleur and her family looked at each other, completely dumbstruck. "If anyone listening happened to be in this tiny French town at exactly the same time and encountered the same exact dog, please let me know," she said jokingly, whilst the interviewer laughed along. Fleur immediately hopped up from her seat on the sofa and found the number for the television station in her copy of the Yellow Pages. "Hello? Yes, I've just been watching your programme with the journalist and the story about the dog. Yes, Ruth McKenna. That's the one. Well, I know it sounds a bit crazy, but I really think you should give me her contact details. We have an awful lot to talk about."
Digital Adventures.